Today's conference on constitutional design and conflict management presents the first ever comparative case studies on constitutional design and conflict management. These studies aim to identify how political institutions can effectively respond to the kinds of conflicts that can arise from social stressors like climate change. The research is part of a much broader program on climate change and African political stability, or as we call it, CCAPS, which assesses how climate change could impact African political stability and international security. The CCAPS program is a 5-year research initiative funded by the U.S. Department of Defense, based at the Strauss Center, and implemented with our partners and researchers at over a dozen universities in the United States, Africa, and Europe. Other parts of the project look at how climate change exposes a variety of political, economic, social, and security vulnerabilities, charts the relationship between various forms of conflict and climate vulnerability, and assesses the impact and effectiveness of aid in ongoing efforts to mitigate these vulnerabilities. CCAPS constitutional design and conflict management research is led by my colleague Alan Cooperman, an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and a distinguished scholar at the Strauss Center. Alan has brought together, as you'll see today, an impressive roster of international experts to conduct these in-depth studies. Today, they'll present their research on 7 African countries, exploring how the evolution of constitutional design over time has mediated shocks in Burundi, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. We are thrilled to hear from these scholars today, who are truly the foremost experts on Africa, constitutional design, and conflict management, and are joining us from around the world, traveling from top universities in Italy, Nigeria, Belgium, South Africa, the UK, and the US to share their insights with us. We're also very lucky to have a top-notch group of distinguished commentators to put some of these case studies in their larger context. It is our hope that these case studies will serve as the jumping-off point for a discussion today as we explore which African countries are especially vulnerable to political instability and which political institutions the United States should promote through its democracy and governance aid programs. Finally, we are honored today to have Ambassador Alan Guthrie here today. We have his keynote remarks on the practitioner's perspective to look forward to during lunch. Now, before introducing Alan Cooperman, I would like to thank the extraordinary CCAPS and Strauss Center staff for the remarkable work in putting this event together. In particular, I would like to thank Dominique and Ashley. Are they here? Where are you? There's Ashley. Well, if everyone, as you probably know and you'll know by the end of the day, they've just done an amazing job of putting this together. So please join me in thanking them for everything. I'm now very pleased to welcome and introduce the intellectual architect of this project, Alan Cooperman. Alan has won numerous awards and fellowships since receiving his PhD in political science from MIT, including most recently being named to the prestigious Woodrow Wilson International Scholarship Program in 2009. Alan, as many of you know, has deep experience in both the academic and policy worlds on a wide range of important issues, and has published widely and to great renown on subjects ranging from the dangers of nuclear proliferation to the complex dynamics of humanitarian intervention. And as you know, he has done a remarkable job making today possible. It is my great pleasure to introduce the host of today's event, Alan Cooperman. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Frank, for those very, very generous remarks. Introduction. Okay, great. First, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, both our participants from 3 continents and our audience members. I would like to reiterate the thanks to the staff of the CCAPS program, notably Dominique, who's now standing over there in the room. Also like to thank Paul Irvin, who helped prepare a lot of the conference and has recently left the CCAPS program, and Ashley Moran, our CCAPS program manager. What I want to do is just put a little bit of meat on the skeleton that Frank presented us with in terms of how we got here, what the nature of the whole CCAPS program is, what the nature of our specific project that we're going to be talking about today is, the CDCM project, and then talk a little bit about the research design, methodology, and what the format is going to be for today's event. So we had a Secretary of Defense a few years ago named Robert Gates. And Robert Gates had an interesting resume in that he had been both in the policy world and in academia. He had been Deputy Director of CIA, then he had gone to be President of Texas A&M University, and then he'd gone back to be Secretary of Defense. And what he realized, I think, from this back and forth between academia and policy is that there were a lot of great ideas bubbling up in academia, but they weren't getting transmitted properly or adequately to the policy-making world. And so he said, well, I'm the Secretary of Defense. I control a $500 billion budget, and I'm going to use some of that to nurture ideas in academia and help infuse policymaking with those. And he created this thing known as the Minerva Research Initiative. In April 2008, the DoD seeks, quote, to increase the department's intellectual capital in the social sciences and improve its ability to address future challenges and build bridges between the department and the social science community, unquote. And this was initially $50 million over 5 years. Now, in the Pentagon, $50 million is not a lot of money. In a $500 billion budget, it's not 1%, it's not 0.1%, it's 0.01%. It is 1/10,000th of the Pentagon budget. So in case you're worried that our national defense is at risk because of the Minerva Initiative, I want to set your mind at ease. It is a really small amount of money for the Pentagon. It is an enormous amount of money in academia. And what they decided to do was not to divvy it up into tiny little parcels, but to put it into big packages for comprehensive research programs. They said they would award 7 of these, and there were over 200 applications around the country. And we were fortunate enough to be awarded one of those for what we call the Climate Change and African Political Stability Program, or CCAPS. The mission statement of CCAPS program is straightforward. We seek, quote, to better understand the relationship between the growing threat of climate change and the ability of African countries to manage complex emergencies, including humanitarian disasters and violent conflict. The program is based here at the University of Texas at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. But we have partner institutions who play crucial roles at the University of North Texas, the College of William and Mary, and Trinity College in Dublin. The CCAPS program as a whole is divided into 6 projects, of which today we'll be talking about 1, highlighted in gold. But I'd like to just go over the other 5 briefly to put the whole program in perspective and to put our project in the context of the larger program. So the first project is about climate change vulnerability assessment. What this attempts to do is to look at Africa and see where do we expect people to be at greatest risk. And this is a result of several possible factors that could increase vulnerability or the scale of vulnerability. So where do we expect there to be extreme weather going forward? This has to do with climate modeling. Where are there large concentrations of population? Where is healthcare generally subpar? And where is governance perhaps not up to the task of handling a weather emergency? And when you put all those together, you should find the places where lots of people should be at high risk. And that's where you might want to focus your efforts. Secondly, we have the social conflict in Africa, the climate change and conflict project. And what that attempts to do is to look quantitatively, look statistically from the past and see what are the correlations between weather events and conflict. And our definition of conflict is finer grained than in a lot of previous work. So a lot of previous work has looked at full-blown civil war. What we do is we look at the smaller scale events that might lead ultimately to civil war or genocide. So we look at protests, demonstrations, strikes, all sorts of political events that might flourish into something that we don't want to see. And we see, is this correlated more with rain? Is it more correlated with drought? And the folks based at University of North Texas have created a new database known as the SCAD database, or Social Conflict in Africa. And we are creating a dashboard that will have all of this quantitative data easily accessible through the CCAPS website. The third project is the one we'll be talking about, so I'll defer on that for a couple minutes. The fourth looks at governance and accountability, and specifically what we're looking at here is to what extent through democracy promotion efforts and good governance promotion efforts can the industrialized world help promote political and economic development in the developing world? And to what extent can we help promote some of the government institutions that perhaps can mediate and mitigate conflict arising from all sorts of shocks that we'll be talking about today? The fifth of the projects, one way of looking at it is say, well, how about if none of this works? How about if all of our best efforts and studies don't work, and we do get these large, complex emergencies? And even if our studies do work, we're probably not going to stop everything bad from happening. And so in the event of these sorts of bad events, what is the capacity of African states to handle them? And so we'll be looking comparatively at that. And then lastly, we look at the aid portion of this. And we say, well, we know from Project 1 where the problems are likely to be. Where are we giving money for adaptation efforts on climate change? Is there a match, or is there a mismatch between where we think the problems are going to be and where our aid dollars are going? And we're using a lot of GIS technology here to portray this sort of information in easily accessible ways through maps. So now to the project that we're going to be talking about all day today, Constitutional Design and Conflict Management Project, or CDCM. Mission statement is, quote, to identify the political institutions in African countries that are likely to moderate or exacerbate instability arising from both climate-related and other types of shocks. As Frank mentioned, there are 7 country studies. We also have a new database of all African states, which we'll be talking about shortly. The project started in June of 2010 with a planning meeting where we figured out our methodology and research design, our cases. Then we had draft papers prepared less than a year later, and we workshopped those in Antwerp, Belgium. Scholars and authors have been revising those since, and so today we have pretty close to finished papers, final drafts, let's say, and we're going to now be getting lots of comments on those today. We'll then be editing those further, preparing a book manuscript which we expect to publish in 2013. As Frank mentioned, we have authors from 3 continents. I won't say any more about them right now because I'll be introducing them fully as the day goes forward. In addition, we've been very, very fortunate at each of our 3 events to have additional scholars. And really, folks, for those of you who know the fields, you will know this is a veritable who's who of 3 fields. 1, constitutional design. 2, conflict management. And 3, Africa area studies. I was very lucky. Almost everybody that I hoped for in my wildest dreams was willing to participate and spend a day with us, either in Washington, D.C., Antwerp, Belgium, or today in Austin, Texas. So Joel Barkan, Peter Lewis, Michael Schatzberg, Nicholas van de Waal, Jennifer Widner. At our May meeting, Kathy Boone, Abdelwahab El Effendi, Christoph Hartmann, Donald Horowitz, René Lemarchand, Carl Levan, Kwasi Prempeh, and Tim Sisk. And then today, Kathy has joined us again. We double dipped on Kathy, and I appreciate her letting us do that. And then we have a new roster of additional experts, and again, I'll be introducing them more fully as the events progress today. So we have this question, which is, how do government institutions either make things better or make things worse when a state is pressured by climate or by other things? And the question was, well, how are we going to figure that out? And the way we decided to do it is outlined in this research brief, which was published a couple of months ago. I think we have copies here, also available on the CCAPS website. But I'm just going to go through it briefly with you to explain what we did. If you read news articles about climate change and conflict, this is what you see. There's going to be climate change. It's going to lead to resource pressures. That's going to create societal stress, and that's going to lead to wars over scarce resources. And we think that is simplistic. We don't think that that's the way things are really going to work. We think it's going to be more complex. And it's going to be complex in this sort of way, in that, yes, climate change might lead to societal stress, but not necessarily. If you have strong political institutions, maybe it won't lead to societal stress, but maybe it will lead to societal stress. The question then is, will societal stress lead to violence? And again, that will depend in large measure on the political institutions of the country. We're not ignorant of the fact that there are other factors that will also affect this. And we're also not ignorant of the fact that constitutional design is a moving target. And there can be domestic factors that are influencing constitutional design, but there may also be external factors, including democracy promotion and good governance promotion. And as I said, this is another project within CCAPS, but the constitutional design and conflict management is really focused on this. So we knew that this is what we wanted to study, but then again, how are you going to study it? And we could have just, picked some folks and said, here's the country, go study it however you wanted to. That wouldn't have been very rigorous. It wouldn't have been very parallel. We wouldn't have had a coherent methodology. And so instead, what we decided to do was to have an innovative methodology. And that was to look at what we call shocks. And to say, most countries do pretty well most of the time, regardless of their constitutional design. The key moment is when something happens that's unexpected, that puts potential stress on a country, that potentially pits different groups against each other. And the question is, at that hard moment, do the country's political institutions channel things in ways that are nonviolent, or do they channel things in ways that set groups against each other in violent ways? So what do we mean then by shocks? These are what we consider to be relatively sudden changes that affect the distribution of resources and power in a country, whether arising from economic, demographic, or political dynamics. Some of these are related to climate change. For example, drought, flood, resulting famine, or rapid environmental degradation, or, and these are only sometimes climate-related, immigration, emigration, or internal migration within a country. Some of these shocks are unrelated to climate. So elections, especially elections that overturn a regime that's in power or a government that's in power. Land redistribution, dramatic changes in terms of trade. In other words, countries that are very reliant on export of primary products, and then the price of that product spikes or plummets. And resource windfalls, countries that had no oil and all of a sudden they discover oil, and everything changes with winners and losers. How does the country react in those sorts of times of shock? Now, why do we look at shocks that are not climate-related when CCAPS has climate change in its title? There's a few reasons. But basically, there are two. One is that we know that not all shocks are climate-related. So it would be a false analysis to look only at the climate-related shocks. In addition, climate change is a moving target. It's possible that climate change won't turn out to be the problem that we think it's going to be. If so, our analysis will still be relevant and important because we've looked at shocks that are not climate-related as well. And so we don't really care if the shock is climate-related or not climate-related. We want to know when these shocks hit, which political institutions help and which political institutions hurt. And the reason is obvious, because if the United States and other countries are going to be promoting political institutions in the developing world, including in Africa, we need to know which institutions we should be promoting. We don't want to inadvertently throw fuel on the fire. What about constitutional design? This is, for us, defined as the formal and informal structures of countrywide governance. So this includes things such as accommodation. That is, for example, guarantees of a certain amount of power or prestige or economic support for certain groups. Or integration. These are things that, instead of providing separate things for separate groups, tend to drive countries together. And Ellie will be talking more about this in his presentation. Election rules. Is it proportional representation or is it majoritarian? Devolution of authority. This can be either territorial devolution or it can be devolution to identity groups. Redistribution. These are transfer payments, for example, from one region to other regions, from the core to the periphery. Separation of powers provisions for the three branches of government, and other factors. In the literature, there are lots and lots of claims about how constitutional design can make things better or worse. So, for example, there are lots of calls for autonomy for ethno-religious groups. There's calls for a weak executive, for a strong parliament, for proportional representation. But there is really little rigorous testing of these claims, especially in Africa. And that's what our project is intended to do. So as Frank said, these are the countries that we are going to be looking at. We wanted to do case studies because we're interested in causation. We're interested in tracing specifically when that shock hits. Does it go to violence or does it go to a peaceful outcome? And in between are these political institutions. And the question is, how do they make things go better or make things go worse? And from our perspective, the best way to do that was a close case study. And so we picked these 7 cases. But then as we were looking at this question, we realized that there's also no comprehensive database of political institutions in Africa. And fortunately, we had a very talented graduate research assistant who will be up next, Ellie Pupko. And he has, as he'll talk about, he has created the first comprehensive database on all of Africa. So we have both the case studies and the new database. Our schedule today is as follows. We've tried to group the case studies in ways that we think are logical. So we look at constitutional strategies in the first panel. In the second panel, we're going to look at secessionist movements, and in one case, one that was very violent, in another case, one that was less so. At lunch, as Frank said, we're going to have a practitioner's perspective, and I should have said that one of the core elements of this project from the beginning has been to mix scholars and practitioners, and we have that today as we have 2 ambassadors on the program. In the afternoon, our panel will be on shocking elections. And so these are where the shock was elections, in addition to some other shocks. And then we're going to wrap things up with 2 very, very distinguished scholars who will be looking at lessons learned from the entire project. And then we party. No, then we will have a chance to interact in a less formal setting, and I hope you all can join us for that as well. I will be the gatekeeper and the timekeeper today. I will be telling speakers when they have 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and 0 minutes left. Our speakers will have 15 minutes each today, except on the final lessons learned panel when they'll have 20 minutes. There will be Q&A on every panel. I would just ask you please to hold your questions till all of the panelists have spoken, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. We have 2 interns with microphones. I'll be selecting the folks to ask questions. I hope we'll be able to get to all the questions and answers. We have 16 panelists here today. We have 2 other panelists who, for various reasons, couldn't make it, but through the wonders of technology will be here virtually through Skype on the screen. And by coincidence, those 2 will be on the first panel. So without any further ado, I want to turn to the first panel, and I would ask our panelists and our 2 discussants to please join me up here at the front. And once again, thank you very much.